When German fighter pilots first spotted the new American escort fighters over occupied France in the spring of 1943, they could not believe what they were seeing. The aircraft lumbering toward them looked nothing like the sleek Spitfires they had been fighting for years. This thing was enormous. It had a barrel-shaped fuselage that seemed almost comically oversized. Its engine cowling was so massive that it blocked the pilot's forward view during taxi. The whole machine appeared to weigh as much as a medium bomber. The Luftwaffe veterans exchanged glances in their cockpits and smiled. Whatever the Americans had built, it was not a serious fighter. Kurt Buligan, who would end the war with 112 aerial victories, reportedly dismissed the new aircraft after his first encounters. The P-47 was very heavy, he observed. Too heavy for some maneuvers. We would see it coming from behind and pull up fast, and the P-47 could not follow. Adolf Galland, the General der Jagdflieger who commanded all of Germany's fighter forces, inspected a captured example and reportedly joked that its cockpit was big enough to walk around in. When the Luftwaffe established a special unit called Circus Rosarius to tour frontline bases with captured Allied aircraft, German pilots who climbed into the P-47's cockpit came away bewildered. Walter Wolfram, a Knight's Cross recipient with 137 victories, flew the captured Thunderbolt and found the experience disorienting. The cockpit was immense and unfamiliar, he recalled. With all those levers, controls, and switches, I am surprised their pilots could find the time to fight. The Germans were making the same mistake they had made about America itself. They looked at something that seemed oversized, ungainly, and inefficient, and they assumed it was weak. They had misjudged American industrial capacity. They had misjudged American resolve. And now they were misjudging an American fighter aircraft that would prove to be the most devastating weapon ever unleashed against the Wehrmacht's ability to move, fight, and supply itself. They were about to learn, at catastrophic cost, just how wrong they were. The P-47 Thunderbolt was born from the mind of a Georgian nobleman who had fled revolution and found his way to the drawing boards of American aviation. Alexander Kartveli, who shortened his name to Kartveli after arriving in the United States, had grown up in the capital city of Tbilisi when Georgia was still part of the Russian Empire. His family's aristocratic status secured him a place at the prestigious Institut Supérieur de l'Aéronautique in Paris, where he earned his engineering degree in 1922. The Georgian government that had briefly won independence before being absorbed by the Soviet Union had funded his education. 5 years later, he arrived in America with ambitious dreams and an extraordinary gift for aircraft design. Kartveli found work with Alexander de Seversky, a one-legged Russian naval ace who had lost his right leg below the knee on his very first combat mission in 1915, when his bomber was shot down over the Gulf of Riga in the Baltic Sea. Tsar Nicholas II himself had intervened to allow the wounded pilot to return to combat flying, and de Seversky had gone on to claim 13 aerial victories over 57 missions before the Russian Revolution ended his military career. Now he ran an aircraft company in Farmingdale on Long Island, and he recognized in his fellow immigrant a designer of rare talent. By the late 1930s, Kartveli had become Seversky Aircraft's chief engineer. His designs were already demonstrating the philosophy that would define the Thunderbolt. Where other designers sought to minimize weight and maximize agility, Kartveli believed in overwhelming power. He reasoned that a sufficiently powerful engine could carry the weight of heavy armament, armor protection, and the fuel needed for long-range operations. Speed and firepower, not maneuverability, would decide air combat. But the company was hemorrhaging money. Losses exceeded $550,000, and the board of directors had lost patience with de Seversky's flamboyant management style. In October of 1939, they voted him out and reorganized the company under a new name. Republic Aviation would become one of the most important aircraft manufacturers of the coming war, and Alexander Kartveli would be its visionary designer. The United States Army Air Corps initially wanted something modest from Kartveli. The original P-47 was a lightweight interceptor with an Allison inline engine and just 2 machine guns. It would have been adequate for the wars of the 1930s, but by early 1940, reports flooding in from the air battles over Europe made this design obsolete before it ever flew. Pilots were engaging in high-altitude combat above 25,000 feet. They were taking heavy damage and needed armor protection. They were running out of ammunition in extended dogfights. The lightweight interceptor concept was already a relic. The new requirements demanded a revolutionary response. The Army wanted 400 miles per hour at 25,000 feet. It wanted 6 to 8 50 caliber machine guns. It wanted armor plating to protect the pilot and self-sealing fuel tanks to prevent fires. It wanted 315 gallons of internal fuel for the range to escort bombers deep into enemy territory. Each requirement added weight. Together, they seemed to demand a medium bomber rather than a fighter. Meeting all these demands simultaneously seemed impossible. Kartveli's solution was to build the entire aircraft around the most powerful engine available. The Pratt and Whitney R2800 double Wasp was an 18-cylinder air-cooled radial engine that produced 2,000 horsepower at takeoff. Its displacement of 2,800 cubic inches made it a monster by the standards of fighter engines. The engine alone weighed approximately 2,300 pounds, but raw power meant nothing at high altitude where the thin air starved conventional engines of oxygen. To maintain full power above 25,000 feet, Kartveli designed an elaborate turbo supercharger system using exhaust gases to compress incoming air before it reached the engine. The General Electric turbo supercharger itself was mounted in the rear fuselage, behind the pilot and near the tail. Exhaust ducting ran along both sides of the cockpit, carrying the hot gases back to the turbine. Return ducting brought compressed air forward to the carburetor. This created an engineering challenge that no other fighter design had attempted. Kartveli designed the entire duct system first, determining the size and routing of the pipes needed to handle the exhaust flow. Then he built the fuselage around it. This unconventional approach gave the aircraft its distinctive barrel shape. The design grew and grew as Kartveli worked through the requirements. The massive engine needed a massive propeller to convert horsepower into thrust. The propeller needed ground clearance, which meant long landing gear. Long landing gear needed to retract somewhere, so Kartveli designed an innovative system that shortened the gear as it rotated inward into the wings. The heavy weight required substantial wing area to maintain reasonable takeoff and landing speeds. The heavy weight also required a robust structure, adding still more weight. When Kartveli saw the completed design, he acknowledged what everyone was thinking. "It will be a dinosaur," he admitted, "but it will be a dinosaur with good proportions." The P-47B prototype took to the air for the first time on May 6, 1941, piloted by test pilot Lowry Brabham from Republic's Factory Airfield at Farmingdale. The flight proceeded to Mitchell Field, where better facilities awaited after smoke from oil in the turbo supercharger ducting filled the cockpit. The flight was successful, but the numbers confirmed what everyone could see. This was the largest, heaviest single-engine fighter ever built. Its wingspan stretched 40 feet and 9 inches. Its length exceeded 36 feet. Empty, it weighed nearly 10,000 pounds. Fully loaded with ammunition, fuel, and a pilot, it weighed over 14,000 pounds. Some variants would eventually approach 20,000 pounds, heavier than many twin-engine aircraft. 850 caliber A&M, 2 Browning machine guns protruded from the wings, 4 on each side. Each gun carried 425 rounds of ammunition, giving the pilot a total of 3,400 rounds to expend. At a cyclic rate of 750 to 850 rounds per minute per gun, all 8 guns firing simultaneously produced a combined rate of approximately 100 rounds per second. That translated to roughly 13 pounds of lead hurled at the target every second. A 1-second burst could shred any aircraft in existence. A 2-second burst could guarantee its destruction. The turbo supercharger delivered on its promise. The Thunderbolt could climb to 42,000 feet, far above where most German fighters could effectively operate. The Messerschmitt 109's service ceiling was only 37,000 feet, and its performance deteriorated significantly above 30,000. The Focke-Wulf 190, Germany's best Western Front fighter, could barely exceed 34,000 feet. This gave Thunderbolt pilots a sanctuary where they could position themselves above any enemy and choose when and where to attack. And in a dive, the massive aircraft's weight became an asset rather than a liability. Terminal velocity approached 600 miles per hour true airspeed. At these speeds, the P-47 encountered compressibility effects that made control difficult, but pilots quickly learned to manage them. No Axis fighter could follow a Thunderbolt in a steep dive, and no Axis fighter could catch one either. If a battle went wrong, a Thunderbolt pilot could simply push the nose down and run away. The initial production models went to training units where pilots learned to handle the big fighter's unique characteristics. The P-47B proved too problematic for combat deployment, with fabric-covered control surfaces that caused dangerous flutter at high speeds. The P-47C incorporated metal-covered control surfaces and provisions for external fuel tanks. This was the variant that would introduce the Thunderbolt to combat. The early combat introduction revealed problems that needed solving. The 4th Fighter Group flew the first P-47 mission on March 10, 1943, a fighter sweep over France with 14 aircraft. The mission failed when the American radios malfunctioned, leaving the pilots unable to communicate with each other or with ground controllers. British radios were hastily installed, and operations resumed on April 8. 1 week later, on April 15, Major Donald Blakesley of the 4th Fighter Group scored the first P-47 aerial victory when he shot down a Focke-Wulf 190. The 56th Fighter Group entered combat on April 13, 1943. Their first victory came on June 12, when Captain Walter Cook downed a Focke-Wulf 190 over Blankenberge in Belgium. These early months were difficult. Spark plug fouling robbed engine power at high altitude. The original narrow-chord propeller limited climb performance at low altitudes, making takeoffs particularly challenging. Pilots who had flown Agile Spitfires complained bitterly about the heavy Thunderbolt's reluctance to turn. The 4th Fighter Group's pilots, most of whom were former Eagle Squadron veterans who had flown with the Royal Air Force, particularly resented trading their beloved Spitfires for the fat American fighter. But under the aggressive tactical leadership of Colonel Hubert Zemke, the 56th Fighter Group developed fighting techniques that exploited what the P-47 did well, rather than lamenting what it did poorly. Zemke understood that his aircraft dominated the high-altitude realm. The turbo supercharger gave it full power where German fighters struggled to breathe. Its dive speed made it virtually uncatchable. Its massive firepower could destroy an enemy aircraft with a 1-second burst. Trying to dogfight with a Messerschmitt was foolish, but diving on one from above was lethal. The tactic that emerged was what Zemke called boom and zoom. Thunderbolt pilots would climb to high altitude, typically above 30,000 feet, and patrol above the bomber formations they were escorting. When German interceptors appeared, the P-47s would dive down at tremendous speed to deliver a devastating attack. A high-speed firing pass gave the enemy pilot almost no time to react. Then, instead of turning to pursue, the Thunderbolt would zoom back up to altitude, trading speed for height. By the time the German recovered and tried to follow, the American was thousands of feet above him, safe and preparing for another attack. Zemke also developed the Zemke fan formation, spreading his fighters 180 degrees ahead of the bomber formations they were escorting. This allowed them to sweep for interceptors before the Germans could reach the bombers. Rather than waiting for the enemy to appear and then chasing them, Zemke's fighters went hunting. The tactics worked. The 56th Fighter Group would eventually claim more aerial victories than any other 8th Air Force unit. The arrival of the paddle blade propeller in early 1944 transformed the aircraft's low-altitude performance. Both Hamilton Standard and Curtiss Electric produced these wider blades that bit more deeply into the air, adding approximately 400 feet per minute to the climb rate. This eliminated one of the P-47's most significant weaknesses and made it competitive with German fighters, even at altitudes where the turbo supercharger conferred less advantage. The Germans captured their best opportunity to study the Thunderbolt on November 7, 1943. Second Lieutenant William Roach of the 355th Fighter Group's 358th Fighter Squadron became disoriented in poor weather over occupied France. The cloud cover was impenetrable and his navigation equipment was unreliable. Running low on fuel, Roach spotted what he thought was an Allied airfield below and landed. It was the Luftwaffe base at Caen-Carpiquet. The aircraft, nicknamed Beetle and bearing serial number 42-22490, was intact and undamaged. German technicians repainted it with Luftwaffe markings, assigned it the code T9+FK, and shipped it to the Rechlin Test Center for evaluation. This was an intelligence windfall of the first order. Hauptmann Hans-Werner Lurch, Rechlin's chief test pilot, conducted a thorough flight evaluation of the captured Thunderbolt. He would later document his findings in his post-war book, Luftwaffe Test Pilot. Lurch found the American cockpit baffling in its complexity, with its color-coded instruments and hydraulic systems so different from German practice. But he also discovered what made the aircraft effective. Its high-altitude performance was exceptional, confirming what German combat pilots had reported. Its dive characteristics were outstanding, with stability that allowed accurate shooting at speeds that would have overwhelmed other fighters. Its ability to absorb battle damage was remarkable, with redundant systems and structural strength that exceeded anything the Germans had designed. The captured P-47 toured Luftwaffe airfields as part of Circus Rosarius, giving frontline pilots the chance to familiarize themselves with the enemy aircraft they would be fighting. Hauptmann Theodor Rosarius commanded this special unit, which demonstrated captured Allied aircraft throughout the Reich, so that German pilots would recognize them and understand their capabilities. The assessments that came back were increasingly respectful. German pilots noted that the Thunderbolt could not turn with a Messerschmitt 109 or a Focke-Wulf 190 in a sustained dogfight. But they also noted that Thunderbolt pilots rarely attempted sustained dogfights. They dove, they killed, and they vanished back to altitude before anyone could pursue them. Heinz Baer, one of the highest-scoring German aces with over 220 victories, delivered the most telling assessment of the P-47. The Thunderbolt, he warned his fellow pilots, could absorb an astounding amount of lead and had to be handled very carefully. This was advice that many German pilots would learn too late. The truth of Baer's warning became legendary on June 26, 1943. Lieutenant Robert Johnson of the 56th Fighter Group was bounced by Focke-Wulf 190s of Jagdgeschwader 26 over France. The mission had been routine until the German fighters appeared out of the sun. Johnson never saw them coming. The German attack was devastating. 21 rounds from 20mm cannon ripped through Johnson's aircraft. Over 200 rounds of 7.92mm machine gun fire added to the destruction. The hydraulic system failed completely, leaving him without brakes or flaps. Fire broke out in the cockpit, filling the confined space with smoke and flames. The canopy jammed shut, trapping Johnson inside. The P-47 went into an uncontrolled spin, plummeting toward the French countryside below. Johnson somehow regained control of his shattered aircraft. He beat out the flames with his gloved hands. With no hydraulics and severe battle damage, he nursed the Thunderbolt toward the English Channel. His only hope was to reach England before the aircraft fell apart around him. But his ordeal was not over. A single Focke-Wulf 190 followed him, determined to finish the job. As Johnson limped along at reduced speed, the German made repeated firing passes. More bullets and cannon shells struck the already devastated Thunderbolt. The windscreen was so covered in oil from the damaged engine that Johnson could barely see. He could not maneuver, could not fight back, could only absorb the punishment and pray his aircraft held together. Finally, after what must have seemed like an eternity, the German pilot pulled alongside Johnson's cockpit. Through the oil-stained glass, Johnson could see the enemy pilot looking at him. The German seemed to be assessing the damage, perhaps disbelieving that the American aircraft was still flying. Then he rocked his wings in salute, turned away, and flew back toward France. He had exhausted his ammunition trying to bring down the stubborn American fighter, and he had failed. Johnson landed his P-47 at an English airfield with over 200 bullet holes counted in the fuselage and wings. 21 of those holes had been made by 20mm explosive cannon shells. Any one of those hits would have been fatal to most fighters. The aircraft, a P-47C2RE with serial number 41-6235 and nicknamed Half Pint, was repaired rather than scrapped, transferred to the 9th Air Force's 36th Fighter Group, and continued flying combat missions until it was finally lost on August 13, 1944. Johnson himself was back in the air within 5 days of his ordeal, flying again on July 1st. The secret to the P-47's legendary survivability was its air-cooled radial engine. The R-2800 weighed approximately 2,300 pounds, and that massive chunk of metal served as frontal armor for the pilot. Enemy fire that struck the engine cowling had to penetrate the engine itself before reaching the pilot behind it. Unlike liquid-cooled engines that relied on circulating coolant to prevent overheating, the radial engine cooled itself through direct airflow over its cylinders. A single bullet could puncture a coolant line and doom a liquid-cooled engine to seizure within minutes. But the air-cooled radial could lose individual cylinders and continue running. German pilots found themselves pouring ammunition into Thunderbolts, only to watch them fly away, trailing smoke but very much alive. The Thunderbolt produced a generation of American aces whose names became legendary. Francis Gabreski, known by his nickname Gabby, scored 28 aerial victories over the course of 166 combat sorties with the 56th Fighter Group. All 28 of his kills came while flying the P-47, making him the leading American ace in the European theatre. Gabreski had actually begun his combat career flying Spitfires with the Royal Air Force's Polish 315th Squadron before transferring to the 56th. On July 20, 1944, Gabreski was conducting a strafing attack on a German airfield at Bassenheim near Koblenz. Flying too low and too fast, his propeller tips struck the ground. The contact destroyed the propeller and forced him to crash land. He evaded capture for 5 days, hiding in barns and forests, before German soldiers finally caught him. Gabreski spent the rest of the war as a prisoner at Stalag Luftwaffe, where he would eventually encounter Hubert Zemke, his former commander. Robert Johnson finished the war with 27 confirmed aerial victories, making him the second highest-scoring American ace in the European theatre. On May 8, 1944, Johnson surpassed the 26 victory record that Eddie Rickenbacker had set during the First World War. Johnson was the first Army Air Forces pilot in Europe to achieve this milestone. He completed his combat tour and returned to the United States, where he spent the rest of the war training new pilots. David Schilling accumulated 22.5 victories flying with the 56th Fighter Group. The half victory came from a shared kill with another pilot. On December 23, 1944, during the desperate air battles over the Battle of the Bulge, Schilling shot down 5 German aircraft in a single mission to achieve the coveted ace-in-a-day status. His Distinguished Service Cross citation documents the action in detail. Schilling would take over command of the 56th Fighter Group on August 12, 1944, and lead it through the final months of the war. Hubert Zemke, the tactical architect who had developed the doctrine that made the P-47 effective, scored 17 3/4 victories himself. More importantly, his leadership of the 56th Fighter Group produced 39 aces and established the unit as the most successful fighter group in the 8th Air Force. Zemke was a driven, demanding commander who pushed his pilots hard but led from the front. He flew mission after mission, developing and refining tactics based on actual combat experience. On August 12, 1944, Zemke transferred to command the 479th Fighter Group, which flew P-38s and P-51s. On October 30th, while flying a P-51 through a severe thunderstorm, his aircraft encountered turbulence so violent that it tore off one of the wings. Zemke bailed out successfully and parachuted into Germany, where he was captured. He spent the rest of the war at Stalag Luftwaffe, eventually becoming the senior Allied officer in the camp and commanding approximately 9,000 prisoners. In the Pacific Theatre, Colonel Neil Kirby of the 348th Fighter Group proved that the Thunderbolt could dominate Japanese aircraft as thoroughly as it dominated German ones. The Pacific presented different challenges than Europe. Distances were vast. Island bases were primitive. The Japanese flew different aircraft with different characteristics than the Germans. Kirby developed tactics specifically suited to Pacific conditions. He exploited the P-47's turbo supercharger to gain altitude advantages over Japanese fighters that lacked comparable high-altitude performance. His boom and zoom attacks were particularly effective against the lightweight, maneuverable Japanese aircraft that could outturn a Thunderbolt but could not escape one diving from above. On October 11, 1943, Kirby led a flight of 4 P-47s on a reconnaissance mission over Wewak in New Guinea. They encountered approximately 48 Japanese aircraft, including 12 bombers and 36 fighters. The odds were 12-1 against the Americans. In the ensuing battle, Kirby personally shot down 6 enemy aircraft. His wingmen accounted for 3 more. The 4 Thunderbolts returned safely to base, having destroyed nearly a fifth of the enemy formation without loss. For this action, Kirby received the Medal of Honor. Kirby finished with 22 confirmed victories, making him the highest-scoring P-47 ace in the Pacific. Tragically, on March 5, 1944, Kirby was shot down and killed by a Japanese Ki-43 fighter of the 77th Sentai. The 56th Fighter Group compiled a record that would never be matched. Nicknamed Zemke's Wolfpack, The unit claimed 674.5 aerial victories, plus 311 aircraft destroyed on the ground. This was more than any other fighter group in the 8th Air Force. The group produced more aces than any unit except the 4th Fighter Group. And unlike every other 8th Air Force fighter group, the 56th refused to transition to P-51 Mustangs. They kept their beloved Thunderbolts through the last day of the war. The P-47's dominance extracted a terrible toll on Luftwaffe leadership. On October 8, 1943, Major Hans Philipp fell to P-47 gunfire over Bremen. Philipp had scored 206 aerial victories, including 82 on the Eastern Front and 24 four-engine bombers, and was commanding the elite Jagdgeschwader 1 when he died. He was caught by P-47s of the 56th Fighter Group. Philipp managed to bail out of his stricken aircraft, but at too low an altitude. His parachute failed to deploy fully before he struck the ground. On March 2, 1944, Major Egon Meyer was shot down near Normandy in France. Meyer was the first German pilot to score 100 aerial victories entirely on the Western Front. He had pioneered the head-on attack against American bomber formations, a tactic that exploited the B-17's relatively weak forward armament. Research attributes his death to Lieutenant Walter Gresham of the 358th Fighter Squadron, 355th Fighter Group, flying a P-47. On May 12, 1944, Major Gunther Rahl engaged P-47 pilots and took 50 caliber fire that shot off his left thumb. Rahl, who had accumulated 275 victories to become the third highest scoring ace in history, was forced to bail out. He survived but never fully recovered the use of his injured hand. The Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum holds the glove he was wearing when the bullet struck. As 1944 progressed, the P-47 found its ultimate calling. The P-51 Mustang, with its superior range and fuel efficiency provided by the laminar flow wing and Merlin engine, gradually took over the long-range escort mission. But the Thunderbolt possessed capabilities that made it the deadliest ground attack aircraft of the war. The air-cooled engine that had proven so resistant to enemy fire in air combat was equally resistant to ground fire during strafing runs. A Mustang pilot who took a bullet through his coolant system had minutes to live. A Thunderbolt pilot could take hits to the engine and keep flying. The heavy airframe that critics had mocked could carry 2,500 pounds of external ordnance. This was half the bomb load of a B-17 Flying Fortress, carried by a single-engine fighter. Under its wings, the P-47 could carry 1,000-pound bombs, 10 high-velocity aircraft rockets capable of penetrating 4 feet of reinforced concrete, napalm canisters, or any combination of destruction that mission planners could devise. The 9th Air Force, the largest tactical air command in history, operated over 3,500 aircraft dedicated to supporting the ground forces. P-47 groups became the hammer that shattered German logistics, transportation, and armoured formations throughout France, the Low Countries, and Germany itself. Where bombers struck strategic targets deep in the Reich, the Thunderbolts ruled the battlefield itself. German soldiers learned a new terror they called Jabo Tod, death by fighter bomber. The American aircraft seemed to be everywhere. Any vehicle that moved on a road was subject to instant attack. Any column of troops was a target. Any locomotive, any train, any supply dump attracted the deadly Thunderbolts. The testimonials from German commanders paint a picture of apocalyptic destruction. Major Helmut Rittgen of the elite Panzer Lehr Division wrote of his experience during Operation Cobra, the American breakout from Normandy in late July 1944. Every road to my panzers was monitored by the murderous circling Thunderbolts. One had to play Russian roulette by trying to outwit the pilots. The Panzer Lehr Division, one of Germany's finest armoured formations, was effectively destroyed during Cobra, largely from air attack. Colonel Hans von Luck, commanding panzer forces in Normandy, recorded in his memoir Panzer Commander that appalling scenes took place as enemy planes were swooping down uninterruptedly on anything that moved. Von Luck was a veteran of campaigns in Africa, Russia, and France. He had seen the worst that war could offer. But the concentrated air attacks in Normandy exceeded anything in his experience. An operations officer in a flak unit of the 17th SS Panzergrenadier Division kept a diary during the American breakout from Normandy. His entries capture the chaos that air power inflicted on German forces. Wild confusion in all units, roads clogged with vehicles, heavy losses caused by Jabo attacks. The entire valley we are in seems to be on fire. Thick columns of smoke rise from the shot-up vehicles. Amongst them, ammunition shoots upwards. The statistics from D-Day to VE Day reveal the scale of destruction that P-47 units inflicted on the German war machine. Pilots claimed 86,000 railroad cars destroyed, 9,000 locomotives destroyed, 6,000 armored fighting vehicles destroyed, 68,000 trucks destroyed. These numbers represent claims from pilot reports and were likely inflated, as wartime claims typically exceeded actual destruction. But even conservative estimates confirm that the Thunderbolt devastated German logistics. Over the entire war, Thunderbolt pilots dropped approximately 132,000 tons of bombs and fired 135 million rounds of 50 caliber ammunition. They flew 546,000 combat sorties, more than any other American fighter type. Individual battles produced concentrated devastation that defied imagination. On July 29, 1944, the 405th Fighter Group caught a German column trapped during the Battle of Ronce in the aftermath of Operation Cobra. The Germans were attempting to retreat through a gap in the American lines when aircraft found them. For over 6 hours, the P-47s attacked relentlessly. Ground surveys afterward confirmed 66 tanks, 204 vehicles, and 11 artillery pieces destroyed by the 405th alone. Royal Air Force Typhoons also participated in the attack, bringing the total destruction even higher. On December 17, 1944, as the German offensive that became known as the Battle of the Bulge caught American forces by surprise, the 365th Fighter Group discovered a Wehrmacht column near Monschau. The German vehicles were bumper to bumper, stretching over 4 miles along a road with no room to disperse. The group, nicknamed the Hell Hawks, attacked with everything they had. Over 115 vehicles and artillery pieces were verified destroyed, with 65 additional vehicles damaged beyond repair. 2 P-47 pilots were lost to anti-aircraft fire. Perhaps the most dramatic testament to the P-47's psychological impact came in September of 1944. General Major Botho Elster was retreating northward through France with approximately 20,000 German troops. Cut off from the main German forces by the rapid Allied advance, pursued by French resistance fighters who harassed his column constantly, and lacking the transportation to move quickly, Elster's command was in desperate straits. On September 8th, 16 P-47s flew low over Elster's column near Issoudun, their engines roaring just above the treetops. This show of force was arranged by Major General Robert Macon of the 83rd Infantry Division as a substitute for the infantry demonstration he lacked the troops to provide. Macon wanted Elster to understand what would happen if he chose to fight. The 16 Thunderbolts made the message unmistakable: surrender or be annihilated from the air. On September 16, 1944, Elster formally surrendered at the Beaugency Bridge over the Loire River. The tally was staggering: 754 officers, approximately 18,850 enlisted men, 2 women. The total exceeded 19,600 personnel, making this the largest negotiated mass surrender to American forces on the Western Front at that point in the war. At the surrender ceremony, Elster pointedly handed his pistol to Major General Robert Macon of the 83rd Infantry Division, rather than to a lower-ranking officer. Major General Otto Wayland of the 19th Tactical Air Command was also present at the ceremony. The Army Air Forces later claimed this as the first time in history that airplanes, unaided by ground troops, forced the surrender of a large enemy force. This overstated the case somewhat, as French resistance forces and negotiations had also played crucial roles. But the air power threat had been decisive. A German military court later sentenced Elster to death in absentia for surrendering without authorization. He survived the war anyway, living until June of 1952. Republic Aviation's production effort matched the Thunderbolt's insatiable combat appetite. The company's factory at Farmingdale expanded to quadruple its original size, adding 3 new runways to handle the constant stream of aircraft being completed and tested. Workers shifted to round-the-clock operations, but even this was not enough to meet demand. A second factory opened in Evansville, Indiana, finished 3 months ahead of schedule in August of 1943. The Evansville plant employed approximately 5,000 workers, roughly 40% of whom were women. These female workers adopted the nickname raiderettes and proved themselves the equal of any aircraft workers in the country. Quality control inspections found Evansville production fully meeting Republic's exacting standards. The Evansville factory would ultimately produce 6,242 P-47s, more than a third of the total production run. Curtiss Wright built an additional 354 P-47G models under license at their Buffalo, New York facility. Combined with Republic's own production, the total reached 15,683 Thunderbolts, making it the most produced American fighter of the war, narrowly edging out the P-51 Mustang. The major production variants told the story of the aircraft's evolution. The P-47B, with 171 built, was the initial production model used primarily for training and evaluation. The P-47C, 602 built, introduced the capability to carry external fuel tanks and bombs and entered combat first. The P-47D was the definitive model, with 12,602 aircraft produced across more than 21 subvariants. Early D models retained the original Razorback fuselage with its rearward blind spot. From the D-25 onward, Republic introduced the distinctive bubble canopy that gave pilots 360-degree visibility. This modification dramatically improved pilot survivability by eliminating the blind spot where enemy fighters could approach unseen. The P-47M was a specialized sprint interceptor, with only 130 built. Powered by the R-2857C engine, producing 2,800 horsepower with water injection, it could reach 473 miles per hour, making it one of the fastest piston-engine fighters of the war. The M model was designed specifically to catch V-1 flying bombs and Me-2, 62 jets, the new German weapons that conventional fighters struggled to intercept. The P-47N was the final production variant, with 1,816 built. It featured a completely redesigned wet wing with internal fuel tanks that gave it a maximum range of approximately 2,200 miles and a combat radius of roughly 1,000 miles. This was the variant that finally gave the Pacific Theater an escort fighter, capable of accompanying B-29 superfortresses on long-range missions over the Japanese home islands. The 318th Fighter Group flew P-47Ns from Ishima off Okinawa in the spring of 1945, conducting fighter sweeps over southern Japan that netted nearly 40 aerial victories in just 2 missions on May 25th and 28th. At war's end, the average cost of a P-47 had fallen to approximately $83,000, though this represented the efficient late-war production figure rather than the overall wartime average. The Thunderbolt served with distinction beyond American forces. The Royal Air Force received approximately 830 Thunderbolts, which equipped 16 squadrons in the Southeast Asia Command. Every single British Thunderbolt served in Burma and India, replacing aging Hurricanes in the ground attack role. The RAF designated Razorback variants as Thunderbolt Mark I and bubble-top variants as Thunderbolt Mark II. British pilots appreciated the aircraft's ruggedness and firepower, though they shared American pilots' frustrations with its limited maneuverability at low altitude. Brazil's 1st Fighter Aviation Group flew approximately 2,550 combat sorties over Italy from November 1944 through May 1945. Brazilian pilots destroyed over 1,300 motor vehicles along with bridges, supply depots, and rolling stock. 5 Brazilian pilots died in action. In recognition of their service, the unit received the United States Presidential Unit Citation, though the formal presentation did not occur until April 22, 1986, more than 4 decades after the war ended. Mexico's 201st Fighter Squadron flew approximately 795 sorties in the Philippines from June through August of 1945. The Mexican pilots encountered almost no Japanese aircraft in the war's final months, but 5 pilots died from operational causes, including fuel exhaustion and crashes. The squadron represented Mexico's only direct combat contribution to the Pacific War. France received 446 P-47D models that saw extensive combat in the final campaigns of 1944 and 45. French Thunderbolts continued flying through the 1950s, serving in the Algerian War long after most American P-47s had been scrapped or relegated to Air National Guard service. The Soviet Union received approximately 200 P-47s through Lend-Lease, Soviet pilots assigned to the Northern Fleet's 255th Fighter Aviation Regiment found the big American fighter poorly suited to the low-altitude combat that characterized the Eastern Front. The turbo supercharger that gave the Thunderbolt such advantages at high altitude provided little benefit in the treetop combat over Russia. The P-47 never achieved the success in Soviet service that it enjoyed elsewhere. A captured German pilot, watching factory-fresh replacement P-47s arrive at an American airfield just days after Operation Bodenplatte had destroyed Thunderbolts on the ground at Metz Frescati on January 1, 1945, delivered what may be the war's most succinct strategic assessment. That, he said, pointing at the endless stream of new aircraft, is what is beating us. The German offensive had succeeded tactically, destroying hundreds of Allied aircraft on the ground. But within days, American production had replaced every loss. The Luftwaffe could never recover its losses so quickly. The P-47 Thunderbolt inverts every expectation about fighter aircraft design. Its enormous size, crushing weight, and barrel-shaped fuselage all derived from engineering decisions that made it the most survivable and versatile fighter of the war. The turbo supercharger ducting that created the bloated fuselage gave it unmatched performance at high altitude. The massive radial engine that made it heavy also absorbed punishment that would have destroyed any liquid-cooled power plant. The airframe that seemed ungainly could carry 2,500 pounds of bombs and rockets while shrugging off battle damage that would have killed any sleeker fighter. The numbers confirm what German soldiers learned through bitter experience. Over 546,000 combat sorties, the Thunderbolt achieved a kill ratio of 4.6 to 1, while losing only 0.7% of aircraft per sortie. This was the lowest combat loss rate of any Allied fighter. 7 of the top 10 American aces in Europe flew P-47s for at least part of their combat careers. Alexander Kartveli lived to see his creation's legacy celebrated. He continued working for Republic Aviation after the war, designing jet fighters, including the F-84 Thunderjet and the legendary F-105 Thunderchief that would carry the lineage of rugged, powerful Republic fighters into the supersonic age. He died on July 20, 1974, exactly 30 years after Gabreski's propeller struck the ground at Bassenheim. By then, the P-47 had taken its place among the most important aircraft in aviation history. The designer who built this aircraft around an engine too powerful for any conventional airframe, who routed exhaust ducting along the cockpit walls and created a fuselage shaped like a barrel, had seen something that his critics missed. Alexander Kartveli understood that the path to air superiority ran through overwhelming force, not aerodynamic elegance. He designed a dinosaur with good proportions, and that dinosaur dominated the skies over 2 continents. The Luftwaffe pilots who laughed at the P-47 in the spring of 1943 were not laughing by 1945. The survivors had learned what Heinz Baer meant when he warned that the big American fighter had to be handled very carefully. And thousands of their comrades, from new pilots to 100 victory aces, had discovered that the oversized, seemingly ungainly Thunderbolt was the last thing they would ever see.